This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. If you're a regular listener to this show, you know that I've been thinking a lot about protests these days. What makes a protest work? What makes a protest fail? And every week, it seems like there's more to consider.
We move now to other major news on this Saturday night. Massive crowds gathering from coast to coast for those so-called No King's Day protests, counter-programming to the military.
Some protests have been highly coordinated, planned in advance.
What's going on?
Let me show you, Chris. So these are two protests converging at the same time here. I want to show you this one.
Others are not.
You see, your sign says,
"We are not criminals."
Whoa, let's go.
Peaceful protest. We're not doing nothing wrong.
But one thing's clear. The protests we're seeing now, they're not going away. Alleen Brown, she's been thinking about protest, too.
You know, I think maybe I'm especially interested in the ways that, I guess, legislators and other entities are turning to a range of familiar tactics to crack down on these protests.
Alleen is not exactly a protest reporter, but she's an expert in one protest in particular, the Standing Rock protest back in 2016, the one that tried to block the construction of the Dakota Access pipeline. Alleen did a whole podcast about it, and she sees echoes of Standing Rock everywhere.
The National Guard being called into LA, that felt familiar to me.
The National Guard got called in North Dakota too, right?
It did, yeah. And I think in both cases, I think you saw a really disproportionate response to what was happening on the ground. The escalation is one thing that feels familiar.
One thing I've taken away from your reporting is that it can be chaotic in the moment to really understand what's happening and what everyone's various interests are. And you really don't necessarily know what was going on until years later.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one thing that took a while to really get details about was the question of movement infiltration, you know, the presence of law enforcement and private security personnel sort of disguised as members of movements within the crowds. That's something I think we can assume is happening within some of these anti-ICE movements that we probably won't have the details of for a while.
That sounds so conspiratorial.
Yeah. I mean, the documents are there. What we heard a lot was people saying, wow, I really thought that we were being watched. I thought these types of surveillance things were happening. But this kind of confirms that we weren't just conspiracy brained.
Those protests at Standing Rock lasted 10 months. But the consequences of all this infiltration and policing, those are still being felt today.
You know, the Standing Rock protest, it didn't work in the traditional sense. The pipeline got built. In the years since, has the oil company behind the pipeline been gracious about its win here?
No, absolutely not. The oil was already pumping, and this giant pipeline company came out with this massive lawsuit against this network of environmental nonprofits, Greenpeace.
Sounds like it wasn't enough to win. They wanted to bury the opposition.
Yeah, they wanted to bury the opposition. They wanted to send a message about, you know, what you might face if you challenge a project like this. It absolutely wasn't enough to just get the oil flowing.
Today on the show, Alleen says what happened in Standing Rock is a warning to protesters even now. We'll explain why. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game, shifting a little money here, a little there, just hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill, too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's smart to always have a few financial goals. And here's a really smart one you can set. Earning cash back on what you buy every day. With Discover, you can. Get this. Discover automatically matches all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year. Seriously. All of it. Discover trusts you to make smart decisions. After all, you listen to this podcast. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
I want to kind of tell the story from the beginning, if we can. You're the host of this season of a podcast called Drilled, and you focus on the legal aftermath of the Standing Rock protests in North Dakota. Can you take me back 10 years ago to 2016, set the stage, talk to me about what happened first? We have this company called Energy Transfer building the Dakota Access pipeline, turned into a huge international standoff between indigenous activists and big energy. Where do you start this story?
I mean, I think the story really begins with grassroots community members who were part of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. People from Standing Rock learned about the pipeline that was planned to pass just upstream of their drinking water intake system. And they began to get organized to try to stop this project from being built.
The idea was if the pipeline leaks, it could leach into the water supply.
Exactly. People were concerned about a leak. People were also concerned about sacred places along the pipeline route. The pipeline passes through what's known as unceded treaty territory. So this is land that the Ocechee-Shikoin Nation, which Standing Rock is a part of, never agreed to give up to the federal government. And they have a lot of places on that land that are really culturally and spiritually significant.
You characterize the protests as somewhat spontaneous, right?
I would say no one imagined that they were going to get as big as they did. It started with a small encampment of people from Standing Rock and other indigenous nations close by, and grew and grew. I was there a couple months in. I spent, around a week there.
Over the weeks, how did the protest change? Like, I know it initially started with the indigenous population, and then it felt like it became like a magnet to me.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest things that happened were these sort of spectacular incidents of police and private security violence. People jumped a fence attempting to block bulldozers one day. They thought sacred sites were about to be destroyed. And the pipeline company's security folks sicked dogs on the pipeline opponents.
You play this audio of, I think, it's Democracy Now! Amy Goodman's literally like, the dog has blood on its nose.
Protester. Are you telling the dogs to bite the protesters?
It's dramatic.
Yeah, it's very dramatic. And that video actually is one of the things that really made this movement go viral internationally. Suddenly, like thousands and thousands of people were flooding into these anti-pipeline encampments.
How did the protests end?
Part of that story is that Donald Trump came into office. As soon as he entered office, he basically told the Army Corps to grant permission for the pipeline to go ahead. By then, it was February. It was really cold. A lot of people had left already. But yeah, basically, law enforcement evicted the camps, and the federal government gave the green light for the pipeline to go under the river.
So fast forward to 2017. Protests are over. Pipeline is operational. Oil is flowing, but Energy Transfer, the oil company, launches this massive lawsuit against a couple of protesters, but then also Greenpeace. And my understanding is that this was kind of wild to people who knew what had been happening at Standing Rock, because Greenpeace wasn't a major organizer, instigator on the scene. Tell me about this lawsuit. Why was Greenpeace named here?
Yeah, I mean, when I first read that complaint in the summer of 2017, I was totally shocked. I had never heard essentially anything about Greenpeace having a big role, even after having talked to so many pipeline opponents over the preceding few months. So why they chose Greenpeace? I know now, having sat through the trial, that Greenpeace was on the ground at Standing Rock, but not to the degree that they could really credibly be blamed for driving the whole thing. A lot of people think that part of the reason Greenpeace was chosen is because of their brand name. If anyone knows any single environmental organization, it's probably Greenpeace.
They're a big fat target.
Yeah, they're a big fat target. And also part of their brand is spectacular direct actions. People know them for going out in little boats in the ocean and trying to stop whaling ships.
How was Greenpeace involved?
Greenpeace was invited by multiple indigenous organizers who were on the ground at Standing Rock. They sent, over the course of several months of protests, they sent a total of 6 people who were, Greenpeace employees who were not all on the ground at the same time. Some of those people were helping support what were called nonviolent direct action trainings. Greenpeace spent a total of around $15,000.
Sounds pretty minimal. I'm curious how it compares to how they involved themselves in other protests.
I mean, Greenpeace, what they really asserted in trial is that they have things that are campaigns, are Greenpeace campaigns that they really pour resources into. And this was not a campaign. To put this all in perspective, there were millions of dollars pouring into GoFundMe accounts, crowdfunding accounts, and other kind of fundraising efforts to support Standing Rock. The tribe, I think, fundraised something like $11.7 million. So, that compared to what was coming in is really a drop in the bucket.
I mean, there's legal terminology for this kind of lawsuit, which is a SLAPP lawsuit. Basically, a frivolous lawsuit that's meant to drag things out and suck money out of an organization or a person, kind of like a game of mercy.
Right.
We're going to spend all this money so that then you have to spend all this money and we'll just see how long this lasts. You could say that the lawsuit against Ann Selzer, the pollster in Iowa, that Donald Trump filed, that's a SLAPP lawsuit because it's really meant to just sort of drain resources. It's a mean lawsuit. It's a lawsuit that's meant to it has a purpose, but the purpose part of it is to actually just take financial resources away from someone or something. But what made this lawsuit different? Because the SLAPP lawsuit, the idea of using a lawsuit as a weapon, that's not new.
Part of what made this lawsuit different is the scale of the demands. So initially, this was filed as a federal RICO case.
Racketeering,
exactly.
So implying that Greenpeace is the mob.
Again, this legislation meant to go after the mob and aiming that as a social movement, kind of suggesting that a social movement is synonymous with criminal conspiracy.
It's like rebranding solidarity.
Yeah, it's totally rebranding solidarity. And I think that's a lot of what we see here, kind of taking this organization that provided some nominal support to an indigenous-led effort and making it scary to support a social movement.
The initial lawsuit here was dismissed, right? It was filed in federal court. But then instead of going away completely, the lawsuit is kind of born again in state court, right? In North Dakota?
Yep. And, North Dakota, it's an oil and gas state. It's a state where there's not an anti-SLAPP law.
Yeah, we should say 35 states have anti-SLAPP laws. And they do things like if you file what is regarded as a frivolous lawsuit, it gives the people who are sued the right to be reimbursed for their lawyers' fees. So it offers some disincentive for you to file a lawsuit that may be seen as frivolous.
Yeah, exactly. So that does not exist in North Dakota. It's also a place where the community has really, I think wherever the fossil fuel industry, does a big project, there's a lot of efforts to get the community on board with whatever they're building.
Strategically, it made sense because, You were filing in a state that didn't have laws that may have prevented this kind of lawsuit, but also had a constituency of people who were likely to maybe take your side if you're the oil company.
Yeah, because this ended up being a jury trial. And, the jury pool is this community that really is I think legitimately biased against anybody that supported the protests. Despite all the efforts from Greenpeace to assert that this jury pool was biased, that this wasn't, the allegations didn't hold water, it made it to trial.
What were the stakes going into the trial? Like, how much damages was the oil company seeking, and who was on the hook to potentially pay them?
The demands seemed to be around $300 million, and that was clearly many times over Greenpeace Inc.'s annual budget.
Did it feel existential for Greenpeace?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was absolutely an existential threat to Greenpeace. And I think people beyond Greenpeace, people saw this as a threat to people's First Amendment rights. Because for people who are part of that movement or who really knew what happened there, the allegations were so disconnected from reality, I think it felt like if they could win here, then no one's really safe.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Hello, Slate listeners. I'm Felix Salmon. I host Slate Money, the podcast about all things business and finance. We talked about the taco trade recently. That was the episode called Let's Taco About It. It stands, of course, for Trump always chickens out, and my co-host Elizabeth Spires explained why she thinks this acronym bothers him so much.
He's being called a coward, and he personally can't tolerate that because he's certainly gotten plenty of criticism, even during the first term, that he was inconsistent in terms of what he would promise, what he would deliver, and how many times he would reverse himself. This isn't new.
In another segment, we talked about a recent survey finding that parents are reading less to their kids, which did not go down very well with Emily Peck.
And it quotes some parents saying things like, it's so boring, they always want to read the same books, they interrupt. It's like, yeah, welcome to reading books to kids.
Join me, Elizabeth, and Emily every week on Slate Money, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, it's Anna Sale, host of Death, Sex, and Money. I talk to a lot of people on my show about sensitive parts of their intimate lives. One thing I hope I would never do is share someone's personal story if they didn't want me to. That's the topic of a new episode in our feed with writer AJ Delario, who in 2008 was the editor of the sports site Deadspin. And one of the stories he wrote was about how Brett Favre, the world-famous NFL quarterback, sent a Jets sideline reporter named Jen Sturger messages and allegedly a lewd photo to proposition her. Jen told AJ about that, but she asked him not to do a story.
I remember getting off that call and being like, Jen, I think you just overshared. And I was like, nah, it's fine.
AJ did the story. It went viral and is still what Jen is most known for online. In this episode, Jen and AJ talked together about that betrayal, the years of silence that followed, and the unexpected way they reconnected.
And we both do some Googling, basically just like, is this the person that I had burned years ago? And it turned out that it was. And I said, well, I guess this dog will die.
You can listen to this episode and all episodes of Death, Sex, and Money wherever you get podcasts.
During any given June, the Supreme Court issues decisions at a head-spinning rate.
That's why we call this month Opinion Palooza here at Slate.
This year, a pileup of constitutional crises on the so-called shadow docket means the justices are even busier than usual.
And the outcomes could be even more chaotic.
I'm Dahlia Lithwick.
And I'm Mark Joseph Stern.
And we host Amicus, Slate's podcast about the courts, the law, and the Supreme Court. We're sharing new episodes every Saturday with deep analysis of the legal cases shaping American life.
And we're popping up with emergency episodes whenever the biggest decisions come down.
Find us by searching AMI CUS wherever you listen to podcasts.
One of the interesting things that this lawsuit uncovered is how oil executives were working both during and after Standing Rock to undermine the protesters themselves. Like, one thing you learned from the lawsuit and all the documents that came out, and because of all the people who came forward in the wake of this lawsuit, is that during the protests themselves, the oil company hired a security firm called Tiger Swan. But this security firm wasn't just doing the typical stuff you'd expect, which is like guarding property. They were doing other stuff too. Stuff that was more like spycraft. Can you explain?
The security firm that Energy Transfer hired is essentially a mercenary security firm that got its start in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This organization, this firm, was directly a product of the war on terror, and the people that worked there. It was started by a former commander of the elite special operations unit Delta Force. They were really steeped in war on terror tactics, including intelligence-driven efforts.
So how were they working as like spies mid-protest?
They used aerial surveillance. They listened in on radios. They eavesdropped on, people's radio conversations. Perhaps most insidiously, they were going into the anti-protest camps, pretending to be pipeline opponents and making friends with people in order to gather information, and also sometimes kind of encourage divisions within the movement. They also did some surprising things. They were involved in kind of propaganda efforts that were aimed at the local, predominantly white community in Bismarck and Mandan, where this trial ultimately took place.
It's so interesting because the right wing talks about lawfare a lot.
Mm-hmm.
This really does seem like lawfare.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly categorize it as lawfare. And I mean, we see that in so many different ways with the aftermath of Standing Rock. Also, you could call it lawfare that in the aftermath of Standing Rock, anti-protest laws spread across the U.S.
Like what?
A lot of laws that amplified charges related to trespassing around what they refer to as critical infrastructure. So a lot of these laws are framed around critical infrastructure. If it's critical infrastructure, then that allegedly means that there's national security concerns here. So if you're threatening this infrastructure that's important to national security, then perhaps you could be called a terrorist.
You can really see how this web, right? Looking at this lawsuit, the threats to protest, the people who support protest. In the end, what happened with this North Dakota lawsuit?
The jury gave Energy Transfer almost everything that they wanted. I had understood this lawsuit to be a $300 million lawsuit toward the end when the lawyers were laying out the damages they wanted. There were a bunch of kind of punitive damages, exemplary damages, in addition to what they wanted to be compensated for.
So it was more than 300.
Oh, yeah. Ultimately, the jury awarded Energy Transfer more than $666 million.
Here's what I don't understand. You were in court, right? And you were looking at the same evidence the jury did. How did you come to see it so differently than they did? How do you frame that in your mind?
I was really shocked by the verdict because I sat in this courtroom and I thought, I'm not seeing the smoking gun. Like, perhaps it's not there. Perhaps Energy Transfer won't win this, or they'll win some kind of like nominal damages. I knew how biased this jury was. I knew that, by my count, 7 of 11 jurors and alternates had ties to the fossil fuel, economic ties to the fossil fuel industry. But still, I thought, if me and my fellow Americans are all in a room listening to the same information, we're going to come up with somewhat similar conclusions. And that was simply not the case.
So $660 million. Can Greenpeace pay that?
I don't believe that they can. They are appealing.
So they're hoping someone overturns this. That's their sort of Hail Mary.
Yeah, they are. And I don't know. I don't know what to think about the chances. I think they have a shot, but I don't think we really know what's going to happen.
So you've laid out this toolkit for cracking down on protest, the people covering protest, all those sorts of things. You've said you're worried that this toolkit is now available in our new world where, Standing Rock, the protest was happening at the birthplace of Trumpism, right? Now we're in like the full throes of Trumpism and we're seeing protests ramp up. If someone wanted to look at this toolkit from Standing Rock and say, like, I really don't like these No Kings protests. I really don't like what's happening in Los Angeles. How would that work? Because it seems to me the circumstances are slightly different, right? In Standing Rock, you had an oil company with real interests. That was what was being protested. Now, there's a variety of things being protested. Immigration enforcement, Donald Trump himself. We're seeing, sort of the mechanisms of the state involved. So how does Standing Rock point to what might happen now, decade later?
I mean, I think that all of the strategies used at Standing Rock were advanced by these kind of privatized versions of what could be public institutions. So you had a private security firm infiltrating these movements. Law enforcement can do that if you have support. The FBI can do that if you have support from the federal government. You had a private company investigating protest funding and filing this big lawsuit against the suspects. It could be the Department of Justice filing charges like that. It can be, again, the IRS or the FBI doing that kind of investigation if you have the support of the Trump administration. You had these weird kind of like propaganda things happening at Standing Rock. You can have Kristi Noem do a press conference and say the kinds of things that were sort of being seeded on Facebook pages at Standing Rock.
It's interesting because I think you're saying it's not so much at this point in time more SLAPP lawsuits you fear. It's that the SLAPP lawsuit reveals all the ways that the state could go after protesters and the people who support them now.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I think about it. I think we should certainly be concerned about more SLAPP lawsuits also. But I think right now, again, we have the federal government, the Trump administration, in many ways taking on the interests of industries that would have had to fund this stuff on their own. There's been a lot of indications that the Trump administration is interested in going after nonprofit statuses. So I think everyone is sort of having to decide where they stand and what kinds of risks they're going to take, what they're going to say out loud. We've talked a fair amount about, like, again, anti-ICE protests, but also anybody who speaks out on what's happening in Gaza, who calls it a genocide, can have a target on their back. It's easy to reframe any support for Palestinians as support for terrorism. And we see that happening and that potentially being used to challenge nonprofit statuses. So again, I think people are having to decide where they stand and how they're going to show solidarity if they're going to stand up for the most vulnerable people within their organizations. Because in this case, Greenpeace was really challenged to stand behind the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, which still is fighting the pipeline company and still asserts some of the claims that were framed as defamation in this case.
Alleen, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
I'm so glad to have talked to you.
Alleen Brown is an independent investigative reporter. She's also the host of the latest season of the podcast series, Drilled. Go check it out. And that's the show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Gunther, Anna Phillips, Madeline Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.